Bless you. So, as I said, there's a couple of things that I'd like to go through with you this morning. I went dark very quickly then, I do apologise. The first thing, I just want to spend a couple of minutes kind of letting you know where we're up to in terms of the assignment that you submitted on the 14th of November. And what I've got on this set of slides are just some very straightforward, generic feedback based on looking at the assignment so far. Okay, so there's nothing that's kind of specific to individuals on here, but there's just some general points that I thought it might be worth mentioning. Partly, as I said, I'm quite conscious that your second assignment comes in on Friday, the 12th of December, and you don't get your mark, and feedback from this one back until next Friday, the 5th of December. So there may be something that I mentioned today where if you look back at your assignment, you might go, okay, that was relevant to me, and maybe that's something to think about moving forward. Okay, equally quite conscious that you've still got 2 weeks before the next assignment due in. Some of you've got another assignment before that. The second part of this assignment might be another week and a half in your future as yet before you start thinking about it. Okay, so I just didn't want to leave you too long without any feedback. Just a quick update of where I am in terms of the assignments. So I have read through all the assignments that have been submitted. I've put all the in-text comments on everything that's been submitted, and I am now going back and working my way through doing the summative comments and the marks for them. In terms of the summative comments, what I've tried to do is kind of put in a short paragraph. This is what I've seen that you've looked at in your assignment. I've mentioned something about your kind of conclusion and how you've linked that to the essay title. And I've also, for everyone, pulled out something that I thought was really good within your assignment as well. So it might be something that's quite specific to that one and isn't relevant for anything else. But first part then focusing on things that were really positive. And then what you'll all see then, same as kind of all the other feedback within the department, is there will be those 3 bullet points in terms of things to think about moving forward. All right. So I will have finished marking everything by Monday morning. Things are being moderated on Tuesday and Wednesday, and then the marks will be released next Friday, which is the 15-day deadline from the submission. Okay, so just that you're in the loop and aware of where things are up to. So just a couple of things that I wanted to mention. First of all, as we said this year, then this was a change. This isn't the case, potentially, those of you doing psychology, and in psychology, I know you've been asked to put a cover sheet on. But for the department that education sits in, the cover sheet has been removed this year, and the aim was then that you would put something like this as a header onto your assignment. Okay, so you are noting your student number, the name of the module, and your word count. And the word count for that assignment you've just submitted was 2,000 words. All right, now looking at some people's assignments, most people have done that. Some people have put names on. So just as a reminder, you don't need to put your name onto the assignment as they're meant to be marked anonymously. So just your student number in terms of identification. And then those of you who do have the SPLD marking adjustments, thank you very much for drawing attention to those. So some people have put SPLD yes, for example, or some people have copied and pasted a particular sticker that used to go onto the cover sheet onto that. So I just wanted to remind that. Secondly, then I would say about 50%, I suppose, of the assignments have put in an AI statement. Okay, now this could go at the start or at the end, it doesn't really matter. And I would say people have used AI in different ways within the boundaries of the assignment. So some people have put in a statement like, I haven't used AI at all. And then some people have said things like, I've used Copilot or something else to help me find the sources. Or I've used such and such to help me structure the essay. All right, so just as a reminder for the second assignment, those are still the AI criteria that apply to it. Just a reminder in terms of putting a statement onto the assignment. Now, the statement doesn't count towards the mark, it doesn't count towards the word count, but it does help in terms of the marking in particular. All right, so just noting those as kind of noteworthy points. Now, looking at people's assignment a little bit more specifically so far, these are my general takes on these. So what I would say, every single one I've read so far has been different. Okay, everyone has used a different approach to get to their end answer. One of the things I think is really good in the vast majority of the assignments is people have been really clear in terms of signposting what they're looking at and how they were informing it. So those of you, for example, who had links to practice have used those really, really well. Those of you who perhaps have gone, you know what, I haven't had any experience in school, but I remember when I was in school, used those really well as well. And equally, there are quite a few people who've gone, you know what, at the start of the module, I used to think this. However, watching the Ysgolor video seems to have been quite impactful on many people. My point of view has changed because so people have linked to evidence about what they think and why they think, which is really good. Okay. In terms of what people have talked about, so I've put a few things in red here. So general, people have talked about inclusion generally. People have put in different definitions of inclusion and compared and contrasted them. And I suppose that key bit you were looking at was whether inclusion just meant mainstream or not. So there are a lot of assignments where maybe you've put in one that mentions mainstream and another one that doesn't, and you've contrasted it to show that there is a debate. So I thought that was really good. A lot of you have talked about this as well, which I thought is an excellent point. Inclusion doesn't just mean academic and learning, there's also that social inclusion as well. And a lot of you within the assignment talked about the fact that the main problem potentially with special school is that children were separated, which means it's difficult to make those friendships with other children. And then other people, Bessie, have mentioned things like, you know what, in a mainstream school, some learners' needs are more evident and they get picked on and bullied or teased as a result, which also causes issues with social challenges. So some really good points people have mentioned in terms of that. People have talked about barriers to inclusion and also facilitators to inclusion. So people have talked about staff perceptions. Many of you talked about kind of the medical or social model of need, for example, and how using labels influenced what teachers do in the classroom. Many of you talked about the fact that many teachers don't have enough training, which can be a barrier because they don't feel confident in working with different needs. Therefore, those learners don't get the best experience. And many of you talked about barriers relating to funding as well. People talking about facilitators, again, a wide range of things people looked at. Quite a few things that came through strongly were the importance of collaboration. So maybe different schools working to help each other out, sharing that expertise. And also a key point that a lot of you made was the benefits of communication. And in particular, schools talking to other services, and in particular, the importance of talking to learners and parents. So really good points in terms of that. People also mentioned possible advantages and disadvantages of going to a mainstream school and going to a special school. And I think a lot of you were kind of along the same lines in terms of, you know what, for some learners, maybe going to a special school might help them academically because there is more support, but the challenge is the difficulty in making friends. Okay. This is a key point that quite a few people come out with as well, which I think is an excellent point. When we're thinking about what inclusion might mean, that sense of belonging or feeling a part of a community might be a far more important indicator rather than just the type of school that you go to. So in other words, just because you're taught in a mainstream school, it doesn't mean you're included, because you might have no friends, you might not engage in lessons. teachers might not understand your needs. And then there was some comparison as well in terms of different settings and in some cases across different countries. So people talked about practice in different countries, including Finland, Norway, Germany, Spain, Italy, and there was one other country that I've forgotten as well, showing that, what inclusion might look different in different parts of the world. Okay, so all really, really positive points so far. So well done in terms of linking to those. In terms of things then, maybe points to consider, looking at people's conclusions, I would say there are some conclusions that are a little bit more explicit than others. So maybe some people have concluded, what inclusion is really important and all learners should be included. However, maybe haven't linked it back to whether it's mainstream only or not. Okay. Some assignments have little personal reflection, which is understandable in terms of, I don't have that much experience, therefore there's not a lot I can link back to. And what I would say, the majority of the assignments are around the word count. But there are some that are a little bit far away from that in some extent. Now, what I would say, there's nothing wrong with those shorter assignments, but potentially if your assignment is 1,500 words, you had an extra 500 words there to hit the word count. Maybe you'll see comments like, what, you started really well, but this could have been expanded further. Okay, so as I said, genuinely trying to focus on the positives, and there was something brilliant, something really nice, something interesting in every assignment that I've read. So well done in terms of those. Points to take forward, potentially, I would say, again, there's kind of a mixed bag in terms of this. So some people maybe are a bit more secure in this area. Some people may be a little bit less so. And I've got to be honest, I've worked in universities now for the last 11 years. Citations and references are still something for me that don't come automatically. And realistically, when I'm writing something, I have to make sure I've got access to the guide so that I know that what I'm doing is correct. All right, so what I would say in terms of citations and references, the assignment guidance said somewhere between maybe 10 and 20 references to support the assignment, so a minimum of 10. Now, most people have done that. However, there are some that are a little bit less, and there were reasons. I know some people have explained that to me in meetings over the last few weeks. What I would say in terms of assignments, if you don't have those citations or references embedded within the text, although you make a really, really good point, if you've got that citation, it helps to support it and back it up. Okay, so thinking about your next assignment, that one isn't a reflective one. That's more of a general standard academic essay. Make sure you've got those citations and references in there. And then just a couple of points really, and these things are fiddly and they are a bit of a faff, thinking about the appropriate presentation of assignments and references. So again, just a couple of points really. Things like, when do we put names and dates in brackets? Okay, so I'm not sure what a different term for this is, so I tend to think of this as a direct reference. So if you are specifically saying that someone has said this or has mentioned that, so we've got here, as noted by Thomas, 2023, okay, that's a direct reference, therefore only the date would be in the bracket. Okay, so as Williams 2025 suggested, Williams wouldn't be in the bracket, but the date would be. If it's kind of an indirect reference, in other words, you've put something at the end of a sentence to back up what you're saying, that's entirely fine as well. However, the author and the date would then be in the bracket. Okay, so if it's a direct reference, just the date in the bracket. If it's indirect, the author's surname goes in as well. Second point in terms of references, and I think this potentially is largely to do with when we see them referenced somewhere else. So when we're putting citations in, all we need to do is put in the author's surname and the date. Okay, so we don't need to put the author's initials in the citation. However, we will need to in the reference list at the end. So rather than Thomas DV 2023 says, it would just be the surname and the date. All right. The next one, this is quite helpful to know in terms of, what sometimes it can help you reduce your word count a little bit as well. All right. If we've got 3 or more authors, what we can do, rather than listing the surname of all those authors, we can use the phrase et al. Now, et al. Is a shortening of et alia, which is Latin, I think, for and others. So rather than saying Thomas, Williams, Evans and Smith 2023 suggest, what we can do is say Thomas et al. 2023 suggest. Okay. However, in the reference list, everyone needs to be named in there. And then a final thing I would say in terms of citations, and again, these are kind of minor points, but it's worth knowing. If you've got a direct quote from somewhere, then realistically we should have the surname or the name of the organisation, we should have the date, and we should also have the page number, or in some cases it's a paragraph number. Okay. So just worth bearing those things in mind. And then just another quick point in terms of a reference list and citations. If you've got an author cited in the text, then you need to make sure that that citation is listed in full in the reference list. Anything in your reference list should also be in the assignment. So in other words, those two things should match up. So rather than having a list of, I've read these 100 things, but I've only cited 5 of them. I don't know, I'm not saying anyone's done that at all, but anything that you've cited in the text should be in full in your reference list. Anything that's in your reference list should match up to what's in the assignment. Does that make sense? Okay, and then the final point, this is in terms of the reference list itself. Now, I've put a hyperlink there on the title, which if you click on that will take you to the Swansea Library page. And if you scroll down that page, you will see there are a number of different guides for the APA 7th edition referencing guidelines. And as I said, I've still got to use those when I'm writing things personally. When you click on that page, if you scroll down, you will see there is kind of a brief version, which is 7 pages long, and then there's a full version, which is about 33 pages long. Now, I don't think any of us has got time or the space in our life to kind of read through that 33-page guide. However, the 7-page brief summary is quite useful, as what it does is it gives you an example of what it might look like if you reference a book or a journal article or a website or a document or a video, for example. Okay, and then just a couple of things in terms of the reference lists as well. What you will see in each of these is that some of the text is in italics and some of it isn't. Okay, so if we look at a book, for example, we've got the full list of authors, we've got the year, and then we've got the title of the book is written in italics. If we look at a journal article, which is the second one down, again, we've got the authors listed, we've got the date, we've got the name of the article itself, and then in brackets, we've got the title of the journal. Okay, so it's worth maybe just taking a look at that before submission in terms of checking, have I got the right bits in italics? It's worth checking, have I got the full stop after the date that's in brackets? Okay, now when we're looking at referencing, there's all sorts of different reference systems and they're all equally right. However, the one that we use in Swansea is APA 7th edition, and this is kind of the guidelines that are specific to that one. So one thing, for example, some references would use the word and there. APA asks us to use the ampersand symbol instead. So if anyone does what I do, for example, you found something on Google Scholar, you've clicked on the cite button, you found the citation and copied it across, nothing wrong with that at all. It's just worth checking that it's in this right format. Okay, so does it have the ampersand? Does it have a date? Is the bracket around the date? And which bits of it are in italics? All right, so as I said, just wanted to mention that briefly. For some of you might be looking at that and going, I'm already doing it. For some people, you might be a little bit less confident in terms of that. And as I said, if you click on this hyperlink, it takes you to the Swansea library page. And if you scroll down, for example, this document I think is really useful. So this is the brief guidance about citations, and then it tells you what format it needs to look like. Okay, so maybe as a final check before you submit assignments going forward, just take a look at that. All right, so other than that, that's all I wanted to kind of feedback. I don't want to spend any more time eating into this morning, but as I said, I didn't want you to have to wait until 2 o'clock next Friday to get anything back in terms of the essay. Okay, just thinking about next Friday, we've got our 5th and final seminars next week. The aim of the seminars next week is not going to be to cover any content, but they will take the format kind of an assignment drop-in workshop. In other words, I'll be in the room if you want to come along with anything that you've drafted so far at that point, then I can give you some advice and you can check whether you're on the right lines with that. Okay, so maybe, as I said, something from the feedback today there to consider with the next assignment in terms of starting to draft that. And I know many of you have got another assignment that's due in at the start of that week, so maybe you're not thinking about this one as yet, but next Friday you've got that opportunity to come in and get some support as well. All right, so hopefully that's helpful to some extent going forward. All right, so which one are we on? This then is what we're going to look at this morning. So first of all, welcome properly then to session 9. Can't believe we've only got 2 more weeks after this week before you break up for the Christmas holidays. The term is flying through currently. Now, during the rest of the session this morning, there's 2 things I'd like us to have a go at doing. Maybe we end up just doing one of them because of time when we finish the second one off next week, but we'll see where we go. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes recapping some of the things we looked at over the last couple of weeks in terms of dyslexia, in particular in terms of the impact of labels, because for those of you who choose the labelling assignment for the next one, that might be a useful kind of case study to follow through. We're then going to introduce ASD this morning, so autistic spectrum disorder. Again, we're going to think about terminology. We're going to introduce terms like neurodiverse, neurotypical, neurodivergent as well, for example. So again, that might go back and link to that other assignment, or it might link to another choice that I'll show you this morning. And if we get time this morning, we're going to think about some examples of simplistic communication strategies that we might use to support learners who are autistic or autistic learners. And in particular, we're going to think about social stories, which are a way of kind of using concrete language and visuals to offer prompts in terms of how to engage with different situations. Okay. So just as a quick recap then, we've spent 2 weeks looking at dyslexia. We talked about the fact that dyslexia was a cognition and learning need, which meant the dyslexic brain processed information differently, potentially challenges relating to memory, but also in terms of the processing of sounds, phonemes, linking them back to the graphemes to how they were written. And we went through a number of different studies on the slide last week, talking about whether it was beneficial or not to have that label. And there was kind of a mixed bag in terms of the studies, really. So some of the studies said, yes, it's really helpful to have that label because people now feel a sense of relief to know what I was struggling in class. It wasn't because I was stupid that I thought, it's because my brain works differently. So potentially there are some really positive impacts. However, there were also some other studies which suggested that the label might be less than positive. And potentially there were impacts in terms of the environment. Okay, so in terms of how long it took to get an assessment. Different parts of the country do things differently. We said, for example, Wrexham Local Authority up in North Wales don't diagnose dyslexia at all. So if you go to school in Wrexham, you cannot get a dyslexia diagnosis through the Education Authority. If you go to school in Flintshire, the next door local authority, you could. So the environment can have an impact. There was some possibly negative impact on learners' self-esteem. So we saw a few graphs towards the end of the session last week, which noted that dyslexic learners on this particular survey felt less about themselves in terms of their English ability, less about themselves in terms of their maths ability. And we also saw that parents and teachers had lower aspirations of those learners as well, especially in terms of going on to university, for example. So maybe the label is a positive one, maybe there are challenges, maybe it depends on the individual learner, their family, the school they go to, for example. We also kind of touched on these things to some extent in terms of labels generally. We talked about things like many labels focus on deficit rather than strength. Very much focuses on what I can't do rather than what I can. So maybe do we need to flip the narrative a little bit there? Maybe labels are helpful because they help inform support. But the problem might be we don't put support in place until the learner's got the label. Again, this is going back to Wrexham Local Authority. I used to work with teachers who worked in a particular school, and their policy was they wouldn't look to suggest a learner was diagnosed with dyslexia until they got to the end of year 6. In other words, they kind of kept them going right through primary school, possibly without putting support in place. We said then there were issues as to whether people view these labels and needs as being real. And this again is something we might pick up on in terms of autism a little bit later on. If any of you use X or other social media, there are all sorts of people of a particular generation and mindset on there who talk about the fact, well, when I went to school, there were no learners who were dyslexic, there was no learners who were autistic, there were no learners who were transgender, there were no learners who had school anxiety. And realistically, yes, there were, but the chances are those things weren't identified or as well known at that time. We've also mentioned things like self-fulfilling prophecy and teacher expectancy effect. And again, some of you focus on that within the assignments. Okay, so that learner, for example, who thinks, you know what, I can't do this work. There's no point in me trying because I'm going to fail. And then they end up failing because they didn't try. All right, we talked about teacher expectancy effect. You know what, for those learners where teachers have negative aspirations for them, does it lower their outcomes? And we also very, very briefly mentioned labelling theory last week as well, which tends to suggest that people tend to internalise and become the label that they are given. And if we see those labels in particular as having that I can't thread underpinning it, then that's what people tend to internalise. And then those of you who were able to make the seminars last week, we spent a bit of time thinking about the assignment options for a couple of weeks' time, but we also looked at some simple strategies potentially that we can use with learners in the classroom to support things like spelling and memory. So in particular, we talked about the fact that many dyslexic learners benefit from multisensory teaching. However, this is something that we reduce as we go through school. Okay, so when you're in primary school, you're allowed to pick up letters, you're allowed to use counters to help you with your maths, You read out loud, you talk more. When you go to secondary school, they take all those prompts away from you because they're seen as being childish. We tend to learn silently, we read silently, we lose a lot of those multisensory opportunities to engage. So we looked at things like visual mnemonics. Okay, now I'm sure we can all think of things like never eat shredded wheat, for example, as a way of remembering the compass points. Now, I used to be a geography teacher. I still have to use that when I'm thinking about directions. Sometimes we use things like this. It's quite a nice one in terms of remembering which letters are vowels. So angry elephant in orange underpants. So we've got a picture of an angry elephant in orange underpants. We've got orange reinforcing the letters, and we've got different words that start with those letters reinforcing as well. We've got another visual mnemonic here in terms of spelling. So laugh and you get happy, for example. This is kind of a word within word. Example, would you believe a lie? Okay, so we've got the word lie in believe. How many of you deliberately mispronounce words? Whenever I write the word Wednesday, in my head, I'm going Wednesday. How many of you might have watched kind of the Ace Ventura films when you were younger, and Jim Carrey's going on about BEA beautiful, for example, in terms of mispronouncing words but help with spellings. This one's quite a nice picture. Okay, biscuit. Okay, quite difficult to spell the kind of C-U-I bit in the middle of it. So we've got somebody there who's turned the letters into kind of a cup of tea, and I've chopped the top off, but there is a biscuit that's about to be dunked into it. And then we talked about, especially with older learners, we might use things like this. Now, this is called a word sum, or its more poncy title is a morpheme matrix. So when we talk about spelling and talking about learning to read and write, we very much focus on phonics, which we should do, right? What are the sounds and how do we spell them? But there are other ways that we can split or chunk words up as well. And one of the other things we can do is split words up rather into just its different sounds. We can split them up into morphemes, which are the different chunks of meaning. And when we're looking at morphemes, what we tend to have is a root word that we can stick either a prefix at the start of and or a suffix at the end. And those bits that we add to the start or the end have a meaning in their own right, and they help us to build the word. So maybe this is an approach that's quite helpful in terms of kind of secondary school learners. However, parts of America, Texas, for example, teach writing through morphology rather than phonics. So if we think about this word that's on the board, rupt means to break. And then there's various prefixes we can stick at the start. So we could have inter. So inter means between. So if you interrupt someone, you have broken in between someone's conversation. Bank at the time meant, realistically, pile of money. If you go bankrupt, you have broken your pile of cash. Okay, and then we can put things like ed at the end to show it's in the past tense, for example. And then this was another visual aid in terms of supporting memory. This was something that used in school quite a lot. We used to call this the Spag monster. And what this was kind of a visual aid to help learners to remember to proofread. In other words, once you've written something, you need to go back and check your spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Okay, and we used to have the Spag monster. We used to cut the mouth out, for example, and learners used to have their own cutout of the monster, and they'd use it. They'd kind of move it across the page of writing, and then they'd go back and check to see whether the hungry Spag monster had eaten any of the things that should have been in there, like capital letters or full stops. Okay, so probably not particularly appropriate if you're doing that with a 16-year-old. However, if you were working with learners who were 5, 6, 7 years of age, that might be quite a nice, fun tool to use. So that's where we got up to last week. What we're going to move on to today then is to think a little bit about learners who can be seen as having a communication and interaction need. Now, in terms of this group of learners, I suppose there are two main types. Those learners who have a speech, language and communication need, which is the most prevalent need in schools in Wales, and it's the most prevalent need in particular in primary schools. And we've seen increasing levels of need in relation to this for those children who started school who maybe were preschool during the pandemic lockdowns. Okay, so learners starting school being less able to talk to other people, starting school knowing less words, starting school with less understanding of what people are saying to them or communicating with them because they missed out on those opportunities during lockdown. But equally, some learners will have these challenges as well. So a difficulty in processing what you want to say and verbalising it, difficulty in understanding what someone has said to you, or potentially challenges around the rules of social communication. If you're having a conversation with somebody, that tends to be a back and forth process rather than me talking at you for 20 minutes and not allowing you to respond. And then linking this to where we're going today, ASD, autistic spectrum disorder, autism, for example, many learners who are autistic also struggle with communication and interaction. Up to 50% potentially of learners who are autistic may be non or limited verbal. And there may be challenges in terms of those kind of social aspects, difficulty in taking in turns. And one of the things we see in school quite a lot, which used to really annoy me when I used to see teachers doing it, was look at me when I'm talking to you. Okay, that can be really challenging in terms of trying to maintain that eye contact, for example. So what we're looking at this morning potentially could link back to that labelling assignment. So realistically, we're looking at another label today, autism. But one of the other options you had was this one. How does the environment impact upon a learner with ASD? And if you choose this one, realistically, what I'm asking you to do is to tell me what ASD or autism is. So what might be the causes, what might be the traits and characteristics an autistic individual displays, and how does that impact on their experience in school mainly, but potentially you could also talk about wider than school. So how might that influence at home? How might families be impacted by having an autistic individual as part of the family? And things like how can it be impacted by going shopping or going to the cinema or using public transport, for example. So what I'm going to ask you to do then for a few minutes, if you don't mind, before we go on and look at this in a bit more detail, and I'll give you a break from my voice, which is a good thing, what I'd like you to think about in groups, individually if you prefer, if you're happy to pop this onto the Padlet as well, what is it you already know about ASD or autism? So could be traits. Well, do you know what? I know that learners who are autistic might find it difficult to play with other children, for example. Or learners with autism, a common trait is lining up toys rather than playing with them in the style that we would expect them to do. And then I'd also like you to think a little bit about how the environment could have an impact. So we've mentioned this before, for example, if you go to my local Tesco's at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, they announce that they're going to have a quiet hour. So they dim the lights, they turn the radio off, they have less people stacking shelves. So there's a calmer, quieter environment, which helps people who might struggle with processing all the sensory information that they're dealing with going into a busy supermarket. So are there similar kind of challenges or adaptations in schools as well? As we've said before, going to school is a loud, busy, noisy, smelly place. There's all sorts of different sensory information we're trying to process. All right, so a few minutes. If you're happy to pop something onto that Padlet, what do you know already about ASD? So traits, characteristics, strengths as well. And how might a child or young person with autism be impacted within the environment? One of the things I just wanted to say before I forget, although this title says the word school, What we are increasingly seeing, which I think is a great thing, is there are increasing numbers of learners who identify as autistic starting to attend university. So those levels have massively grown over the last 5 years. So if you do decide to look at this assignment, although it's got school in it, by all means, widen that out to include university if that's something that you would like to talk about. Okay, so I'm going to shut up now. A few minutes, what do you know already about autism? Okay, whilst you're doing that, I'll just come round and collect the register. Does anyone know how far the register? There we go. Just blending in with the table. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for the first one. Brilliant. Snail is definitely not snail-like in terms of speed. Okay, so looking at this first one, I think a really good point here. Challenges in terms of overstimulation, can get overwhelmed, struggle with social situations, communication, can get frustrated if they can't communicate their needs effectively. Awesome earthworm, thank you very much. So struggle with reading social situations. Okay, so that learner who finds it difficult to play with others because they don't play by the rules, for example, or don't understand how to have a conversation, or have got a particularly fixated interest, and what they're going to do is tell you about it for 20 minutes as a monologue rather than having a two-way conversation. Good point again about the overstimulation. Okay, maybe there is too many things going on at one time to try and process that effectively. Sensory needs being a challenge as well. Okay, so I'll just give it another couple of minutes whilst people finish posting. Okay, so passionate penguin. Okay, so again, reinforcing some of those challenges there. Issues with sensory overload. Okay, maybe I'm in an environment that is just too much in terms of sights and sounds and smells and temperature and things going on for me to be able to process. Challenges in terms of understanding social norms, and I think that's an excellent point in terms of the environment. You know what, maybe this learner is having to try and mask to fit in. In other words, they're trying to kind of dampen down those characteristics as a way of showing that, you know what, they're not affected. Shy earthworm, okay, nice point about specific attention span. Maybe particularly interested in something that's got nothing to do with the lesson they're in class, for example. Sometimes non-verbal, sometimes hyperverbal. An excellent point that in terms of echolalia, sometimes these learners seem to have more vocabulary than they do, but what they're doing is repeating back something that they've just heard. Or maybe they're repeating that back at inappropriate times. Okay, so we've got obsessive compulsions, repetitive behaviours. Maybe those repetitive behaviours are a result of an interest, or maybe it's a way of helping to process the challenges they're experiencing. Stimming and self-regulation, excellent. Okay, and then just a couple more, the helpful panther. Right, so ASD, autistic spectrum disorder. I think that's a key point we'll mention shortly. It is a spectrum. Everybody who has the diagnosis does not mean their needs are the same. It can vary from very mild to very severe. So people are on that long line there somewhere. Key point about needing to ensure the individuality aspect, potentially repetitious behaviours, different ways of learning. The loyal bat, excellent point. Every autistic individual is unique. Taking things literally, so we'll have a look at some examples shortly of types of language we might commonly use in class and potentially the unexpected or unintended consequences of those. Difficulties with picking up on social cues. This next point I think is a fantastic one. Spending all day trying to mask those behaviours at school. However, when they get home, that release of that tension and that stress and that negativity really impacting upon home life because they haven't been able to do that during school. Needing to follow the rules, I think, is an excellent one. And then the helpful earthworm, again, overstimulated, thinking about the environment, noise, smells, lights, sounds, temperatures, background information, temporal processing can be an issue, for example, in terms of kind of zoning out of the background talking, feeling rushed in terms of communicating, which has an impact. And then in younger years, thinking about maybe specific bits of furniture they might sit on or using things in a different way. So brilliant. Thank you very much for posting those. And then finally, supportive elephant, just got in on time. Okay, so struggling with the social process and communication, sensory, and then you've got some nice ideas there of strategies that can be used to support. So visual aids, we mentioned things like visual timetables a little bit later on, the use of things like Makaton. If any of you used to watch Mr. Tumble on CBeebies years ago, for example, using things like PECS, Picture Exchange Communication Systems, as a way of supporting children who are non-verbal to communicate. Things like social stories, sensory rooms, quiet rooms, low arousal spaces that people can go to. Fabulous, thank you very much. So, just building on that then a little bit further. Another term that we see very often, and this is a term which I think is really positive in many different ways, but potentially can be an issue in others, is neurodiversity. And neurodiversity, which I'm sure you've come across previously, was a term that came from the autistic community in terms of trying to find a label that better recognised individual difference rather than individual deficit. However, the challenge potentially is that we sometimes use this term interchangeably with autism. So neurodiversity, neurodivergent, that I'll mention in a second, are not another name for autism. Autism potentially comes underneath this umbrella term, but sometimes there's misconceptions because people use it to mean the same thing. So the neurodiversity label potentially is really powerful and really positive because it recognises that every single one of the 8.2 billion people on the planet are individual and different. We all have our own brain, and our unique individual brains learn, process information, think in our own way. So a recognition that every single one of us on the planet is different. We have our own strengths, our own weaknesses, our own challenges. We can then split that down into two other groups, neurotypical and neurodivergent. Okay, so neurotypical, research tends to suggest that about 80% of us will think and learn and process information in ways that are similar to each other. Okay, and people who are neurotypical form the majority of the population. And as we've seen before in terms of environment, maybe we set things up, including schools, to meet the needs of the majority. Those people then who think or process or their brain works differently can be called neurodivergent. Okay, and what this recognises is difference, not deficit or challenge. In other words, the neurodivergent brain isn't better, it isn't worse, it's different. Okay, and underneath that neurodivergent umbrella, originally this came from autism. However, there is now a greater number of needs that are kind of categorized underneath this. So dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia comes under this umbrella term now, as do things like Tourette's syndrome and ADHD, for example. So some people have gone, well, do you know what? It used to be a really positive label, and it linked specifically to autism, but now there are too many needs that are placed underneath it. So has it lost some of its value? Honest answer, I don't know. I suppose it depends on who you ask. So I just wanted to mention the term neurodiversity before we moved on. In terms of what we mean by ASD then, many of you kind of posted this on those Padlet links earlier on. So there is those challenges in terms of how the brain works differently, which impacts upon communication, interaction, repetitive behaviours potentially, and sensory processing. So if anybody wants to follow this up a little bit later, I've put a hyperlink to a short video on the left-hand side of the screen. And then I've just got some pictures on here. Now, I've mentioned one of these before. Maybe people here that you recognise, maybe others that you don't, but potentially have impact upon people's perceptions of autism. So, first one, top left on the right-hand side, film Rain Man. Now, this may be very much an age-specific thing. This came out in 1988. As we said, Tom Cruise on the right of that picture, and his older autistic brother Raymond, played by Dustin Hoffman. One of the first films, I suppose, which kind of had an autistic individual as the main character. And because of that, it influenced people's perceptions of autism. In other words, people who'd watched this film, there was an expectation that everybody who was autistic shared traits and behaved like Raymond's character. And in this particular film, Raymond is not quite non-verbal, but selectively verbal, bless you, has very specific interests, and has kind of a genius level ability in terms of maths and memory. And Tom Cruise takes him to Las Vegas to help him cheat at the casino in terms of counting cards, for example. A little bit more common, I suppose. Many of you may well have seen Big Bang Theory, so thinking about Sheldon Cooper. Again, kind of a mainstream TV program character with autistic traits. And then two people that you may have heard of but might not recognise from their pictures. So has anybody heard of the artist Stephen Wiltshire, for example? You might have seen him. There's been quite a few documentaries of his life on Channel 4 over the years, for example. Stephen Wiltshire is a non-verbal autistic artist who has pretty much a photographic memory, and he can paint perfectly remembered images from memory. So he is quite famous for his paintings, for example, being taken to New York, being flown over Manhattan Island in a helicopter for about 2 minutes, came back to the UK, perfectly able to recreate the Manhattan landscape from memory. His paintings are now worth many tens of thousands of pounds, for example. And then you might have heard of her, and I think she's a fascinating person, and this is Professor Temple Grandin. Anybody heard of Temple Grandin? Okay, one or two people. Now, Temple Grandin is very famous for two different areas. She is a professor of animal science and animal husbandry at a university in America. So she has done a lot of work in terms of animal welfare, has done lots of things. One of her famous pieces of work, the informal term is the cow brush machine. But this is basically kind of a tight device that they kind of ask cows to walk into, which calms them down because they're held solidly when they're being given injections, for example. But she's also famous within the autism community as well, because she is autistic. She was non-verbal until the age of 12. When she was young, her parents split up, because her dad wanted her to be institutionalized because of her behaviours, whilst her mum didn't. So she has gone on to become kind of a professor in two totally different areas. In terms of autistic spectrum disorder, few of you on that Padlet mentioned it's a spectrum. When I did my teacher training back in 1996, for example, we used to talk about autism and we used to talk about Asperger's syndrome or Asperger's disorder. Mention both of those going forward. Today, we don't tend to use terminology like Asperger's syndrome. Today, we use this kind of overarching umbrella term instead. I'm going to pause for a break shortly, but just wanted to mention these next few slides before we do. Now, what I've got on the next couple of slides are some results from the NAS, the National Autistic Society, who did a survey. They do one every year, but this one that I've got up is from 2021, where they engage with autistic young people and also parents, and they kind of find out their views on their educational experiences. And what I think is quite damning in this survey is not many people had much positive to say. So this first one, it might be a little bit blurry from where you're sitting. This is some of the key points from parents. So nearly 75% of parents didn't think their school fully met their autistic child's needs. About a quarter of parents have suggested that their children had to wait at least 3 years before getting any support. They were very frustrated about the kind of damage that was being done during that time when their child was struggling going through school without any support. And many parents didn't know what they could do if they had a complaint or who they could refer to get additional support. So parents felt quite strongly that their autistic child wasn't getting the support they should have done in school. When they looked at the kind of the children of those parents, similar things started to emerge. And again, there's some key points on here, which I think a lot of you had talked about in your assignment previously. 70% of those children said school would have been better for them if more teachers knew more about autism. So in other words, they were going to school, teachers might have known a bit about it, but not enough. This, I think, is an interesting point as well. Less than 10% felt that their peers knew enough about autism. So a lot of you in the assignment talked about the fact that we need to train teachers better. Totally agree. Do we also need to raise awareness of children and young people and everyone else in society as well? So they felt they struggled because teachers didn't understand their needs, but they also struggled because other children in their class didn't really understand them and their needs either. Over 50% of children suggested they didn't have a quiet place to go in school. So a lot of you talked about that sensory overload. So they were in that classroom when they were being bombarded by all that sensory information. They didn't have anywhere that they could go and escape to calm and regulate their emotions and their feelings. So they were kind of stuck in that environment that they were finding difficult. Nearly 50% said they wanted help in terms of planning for adult life. And I think this is quite interesting as well. Going back to some of those points on the Padlet, it wasn't that these children didn't want to have friends. What they needed, they felt, was support in terms of helping them to understand how to make friends. Or maybe that links with that top one as well. If peers in their class understood them better, and they also understood how their peers worked, maybe that might have been helpful in terms of fostering social opportunities. And I like this quote that's on the bottom there: everyone should be trained in autism in school, then it would be a lot easier. This is from a primary school pupil who answered this survey, and I think they had a really good point. And then a few other things, they kind of asked them a little bit more specifically, did they have particular support? And when we look at the bigger numbers, we can see that's in the red on the right-hand side of the screen. They wanted it, but they didn't get it. 86% of these learners said they wanted support to how to make friends or having something like a buddy system. But it wasn't in place in their school. 84% kind of recognised that there were challenges at home and maybe they needed support and breaks away from family outside of school. Don't really know what other was, but 83% didn't feel they had it. 81% talked about the fact they lacked those play or leisure opportunities outside of school. And again, we can see there they wanted help with daily living skills, occupational therapy, mental health support, and so on, but it didn't exist in their settings. So when we come back after the break, we're just going to have a quick run through kind of the brief history of autism, some of the traits and characteristics, how it might be identified and diagnosed, and then if we get time, we will have a go at writing some social stories, which is a strategy to support. If we run out of time, then we'll pick that up next week. So it's 11:03. If we look to start back just after 10 past 11, if that's okay, and we'll move on from there. So I'll just pause the recording now, and then we'll pick up at about 11:12. Okay. Right, okay, welcome back then after break. What we're going to do now then is move on and think a little bit about where our knowledge and understanding of ASD has come from. And today still, it's quite a contentious area where there are all sorts of kind of myths and misconceptions about autism. Now, many of you might remember Donald Trump a few weeks ago, for example, going on to X in particular and talking about the fact that his scientists had proved that taking Tylenol, in other words, paracetamol, when you were pregnant was a cause of autism. And there's kind of scientific advisors have really been pushing that narrative in America. Do you know what? It's as a result of pregnant women taking paracetamol or Tylenol, which there is no evidence for at all. In the UK, some of you might have heard of, for example, Dr. Andrew Wakefield. And Dr. Andrew Wakefield used to be a senior surgeon in the UK. Looking at his Wikipedia page this morning, I thought the introductory paragraph was very interesting. And this is how he is described on Wikipedia. Andrew Wakefield is an English fraudster, anti-vaccine activist and former senior surgeon who was struck off the medical register for serious professional misconduct. Now, Andrew Wakefield is quite famous for two reasons, really. One of them was because he used to go out with supermodel Elle Macpherson, but the main reason he is famous was towards the end of the 1990s, he published a study which he suggested autism was caused by children taking the MMR vaccine, so the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. And his study tried to show that there was a link between children being vaccinated and going on to develop autism. It's since been proven that his study was fraudulent and incorrect, and maybe what his study showed was correlation rather than causation. In other words, what he was trying to say, do you know what, children have the MMR vaccine at about the age of 2.5, 3. It's around about the same time that many children start to show the traits and characteristics of autism a little bit more strongly. So his study was trying to show, well, you know what, children are starting to show autistic traits at that age because they've just had their MMR vaccine. Again, there is no scientific proof to his study being correct. However, one of the issues his study did lead to was a massive drop in the UK and America in particular of parents getting their children vaccinated. And we have, as a result of that, seen a number of different epidemics of measles and mumps, for example. There are all sorts of studies which have suggested his mistruths that he quoted, which became popular, has led to the deaths of tens of thousands of children globally who've died as a result of contracting measles because their parents didn't vaccinate them because they were worried they were going to catch autism. Okay. We've known about autism probably since the 1940s, but autism has always been a part of the human population. Okay, and there are two key figures that have influenced our thinking towards autism. The first one is Dr. Leo Kanner, which you can see in the screen there, and he was a paediatrician working in America, and he was working with children who he saw as having infantile autism. So we've looked at roots of words before, and we mentioned auto means self. In other words, those children who seem to very much look inwards and possibly be trapped within themselves rather than engaging with others. And the group of learners or young children he was working with, he reported that they were unique, they were remarkably different from other children, and what he said required a detailed consideration of their fascinating peculiarities. Okay, so that uniqueness of each individual. At the same time, but totally unconnected, we had Hans Asperger working in Austria with similar children. However, the main difference between the children he worked with and Kanner was working with was maybe the children being supported by Hans Asperger were more likely to be verbal. So Leo Kanner's children were not verbal, the ones Hans Asperger's were working with were. And he defined Asperger syndrome, and he talked about autistic psychopathy. Okay, these children whose personality is very much focused on self, it's inward looking. And he talked about a number of characteristics that people have mentioned to some extent earlier on. A lack of empathy, in other words, that lack of understanding as to how other people work or function or think. Challenges in terms of forming friendships, one-sided conversations, and an intense absorption in a special interest. And he also mentioned clumsy movements. And there has been kind of discussions around whether there is a particular gait or way of walking that autistic individuals display, for example. He also talked about his children that he worked with as being little professors because they seemed to be experts and could talk at great length about what it was they were particularly interested in. Hans Asperger's work wasn't that well known realistically, probably for two reasons. One of them was that it was published in German and wasn't necessarily translated widely into English until the 1970s and 1980s. So two different people, two different parts of the world, looking at children with similar characteristics, both kind of informing that understanding of autism. One of the biggest kind of leaps forward, I suppose, was the work of Wing and Gould, which was published at the end of the 1970s. And they talked about children who were autistic as potentially being placed into one of three different groups. Now, this is the terminology that they used at the time. So one group of autistic children they called the aloof group, one with a passive, and the other was the active but odd. Okay, so putting children into those categories. The aloof group suggested that there were those autistic learners who did not want and actively shied away from communicating and interacting with others, really didn't want to be touched, really didn't want to gauge eye contact with anyone, didn't want to speak, didn't want to be spoken to. Potentially that interaction might have been distressing to those learners. The passive group then they felt weren't children who actively shied away from those things, but equally didn't seek those out either. So that learner who didn't seem to be distressed because somebody was talking to them, but didn't go out of their way to try and engage somebody in conversation either. And then the active but odd group, which is quite a nice way but unusual and perhaps a negative way of putting it as well. The active but odd group, these were those children who would communicate with other people, but it was on their terms about their specific interests, and very often it was that kind of monologue. I'm going to spend 10 minutes telling you everything I know about Thomas the Tank Engine, and I'm not going to give you that opportunity to talk about what you want or to have that two-way conversation. And I suppose one of the key things that comes out of that maybe is that spectrum. So maybe those learners who find themselves on that autistic spectrum, the aloof group, maybe more severe challenges, the active but odd group, as they called them, maybe those challenges were still there, but maybe less of a difference. And what Wing and Gould suggested was that there was a triad of impairment that linked all these individuals and all these groups. So still the word impairment. So 3 things they suggested were going on. So they suggested there was an impairment in social communication. So that difficulty in terms of verbalizing and potentially in terms of understanding and using non-verbal language as well. Some of these learners had no speech. Some of these learners would just babble, for example. And a key one, possibly having no understanding about facial expressions. Now, when we communicate with each other, how much of our communication is non-verbal? And that is really important in terms of what we pick up in terms of body language, for example, or facial expression. So having no understanding, maybe, or not understanding what your facial expression means. He also suggested then challenges in terms of social interaction. So there's difficulties playing with others, difficulty in talking with each other, difficulty potentially in handling their emotions and understanding that other people might think something different or act differently in the same environment. And then the third one was impairment in imagination. And this one has come into question a little bit more recently. So difficulty in terms of thinking in abstract terms. So quite good at seeing concrete concepts, but difficulty in terms of thinking about something that hasn't happened yet, or something that they haven't had an experience of. Potentially challenges related to, many of you put this, that repetitive patterns of behaviour, playing in a particular way. At the time, a lot of it suggests that these children couldn't engage in imaginative play. However, this has maybe been questioned a little bit more recently, and maybe the suggestion is if you are autistic, your imaginative play is different. So maybe it's a different type of imagination rather than you lack imagination. More recently, especially since 2013, we've moved away from a triad of impairment to the dyad of impairment. So going from 3 separate areas to 2. However, realistically, it still covers those areas, but they've been grouped slightly differently. Number of key points on this slide in particular. First one, persistent. In other words, these traits and characteristics aren't just something that happen. They happen for a short period of time and then they go away. So these are long-standing, ongoing traits and characteristics. Other key point, they either happen now or they've happened in relatively recent history. So either the child is displaying these traits now or have done persistently at some point over the last 6 months. And we can see here now this first one kind of puts communication and interaction together, whilst the second one is focusing more on repetition, imagination, and behaviours. If anyone wants to follow this up further, I've put a video on here. The hyperlink is there if you want to follow up. It's about 15 minutes long in terms of kind of traits and characteristics we see in young children, even back as far as babies, for example. But in terms of its assessment and diagnosis, it's a medical diagnosis. However, it's not an illness. Okay, and in terms of diagnosing dyslexia, autism, it's very much observations and checklists. In other words, do we see these traits and characteristics, bless you, being displayed by the individual? Do we see them persistently? Do we see them in multiple settings? 2 key tools that are used. The one on the left is the main one, DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And then the second one, which is less commonly used in the UK, is the ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases for Mortality and Morbidity Statistics. Okay, so even though autism isn't an illness or a disease, it's a different way of processing information. Those are the tools that we use. Just wanted to mention this very briefly and then I'll move on. Again, some of the key points. DSM-5, persistent, multiple contexts. In other words, we see the learner doing these traits in school, we see them at home as well. If we only see them in one context, that might be something specific to that environment. A learner who's non-verbal in school but speaks at home. There might be specific school-based reasons as to why that's happening. They're scared of the teacher, they've got social anxiety, for example, yet they feel comfortable at speaking at home. So these things happen in multiple contexts. That child struggles with a sensory overload at home. They also experience it in school. They also experience it if you take them shopping to Asda. They also experience it if you go to the cinema. They also experience it if they catch in a train, for example. So it's not context specific. And again, that's persistence. Okay, this isn't a result of an event. So that child who used to be verbal, who now doesn't speak very much anymore as a result of trauma because parents have got divorced, or there's been a bereavement in the family, or they've moved home and they've started a new school. Okay, so persistent, multiple contexts. The other one then, ICD-11, also says similar things. Persistent, clearly atypical. In other words, the traits they show are not typical, they're divergent, they're abnormal, observable in all settings, and then also available on that spectrum. So very mild to severe. One of the key things they all had in common then was that challenge with social communication. And I just like this quote that's at the bottom of this slide. So a piece of research by Howlin back at the end of the 1990s, talking to autistic individuals, and he was talking to this 14-year-old boy about why people might talk just in terms of having a chat. Okay, and he called it talking for the sake of it. And I thought this quote was quite enlightening, really. So this boy responded, "Why should anyone ever want to do that? When I talk, it's because I want to know something or because I want someone else to know something. So I'm not going to come round and sit next to you and have a chit chat about what's going on in life. If I tell you something, it's because I need to tell you something. If you tell me something, it's because you need to tell me. We're not just chatting to be social." Common communication challenges. So again, you've mentioned these repetitive interests. Some people on the panel have mentioned things like echolalia, repeating specific words, that inability to have a two-way conversation. And then we did mention earlier on, some of the challenges might be in terms of being very concrete about how they understand language. Now, I've taken this slide from the I Communicate Therapy website, where it talks about, all sorts of types of language we use, which potentially could be open to misunderstanding by somebody who thinks in a very concrete way, which can lead to unintended consequences. And I think we're all guilty, if that's the right word, of using phrases and terminology like this, because we know what sense it is we're trying to say. So this is the first one, for example. Swimming is on Wednesdays. So you've just started year 6 in school, first week back in September, and the teacher's gone, "Well, we go swimming on Wednesdays," which is fine. I understand that, we go swimming on Wednesdays. However, it's half term next week and we haven't gone swimming. Why not? It's still a Wednesday, but we didn't go. You told me that we go swimming every Wednesday, but next week we're going on Tuesday instead. I don't understand why that's changed, because you said we always go on a Wednesday. Okay, always listen to an adult. Kind of a fair point, but what happens if that adult is telling you to do something wrong? This is one I can remember quite often with some of the learners I used to work with. You shouldn't hit other pupils in the playground. Okay, but you didn't tell me I couldn't hit them in the canteen. You didn't tell me I couldn't kick them in the classroom. If you stop screaming, I will let you play with Lego. Okay, well, what if I want to play Lego at another different time? If I start screaming, will you just give me the Lego then? Don't necessarily understand sarcasm and things like it's raining cats and dogs. No, it isn't. It's raining water. Why do we say things like that? So the language we use can be challenging. Got a clip to a short video here. I'm not going to play it because next door will start banging on the wall, but has anyone watched the A Word programme on BBC? Okay, it was on the BBC a couple of years ago, and it follows the lives of a family where their young son, Joe, gets diagnosed with autism. Okay, and if you want to follow this up, what we've got on here is a very short clip. Joe very much regulates himself by spending all his time listening to music on headphones. And his dad is working from home in this particular clip, trying to get Joe to do something different. The fact that Joe is sitting there listening to his music is annoying his dad. And he takes the music away from him. He tells him, right, we're going to set a timer for 10 minutes. For that 10 minutes, you've got to do something else. And Joe reacts in a particular way as a result of that. So a nice example in terms of communication, if you want to kind of follow that up going forward. You mentioned autism. Very often traits tend to develop or become more pronounced when children are around 2.5, 3 years of age, for example. However, some children, we see this right from birth. So maybe those parents who don't interact when they're, babies who don't interact when their parents are talking to them. It's kind of a common natural response that as a parent, if you go towards your child with your arms open, very often that child will respond in terms of that expectation of being picked up. Maybe some babies will just ignore that. They don't recognize what that key means. Okay. However, there are some learners, for example, where their autistic traits don't tend to develop until they're much older. So one of the things we have seen more recently is a big increase in the number of adults who've been diagnosed with autism, and in particular the number of adult women who've been diagnosed with autism. So why might that be the case? Is it a result of a lack of understanding when they were in school? Or is it because going through school, they were able to cope with that environment, but as they've moved into adulthood and the environment has changed and become more complicated, that's when their coping mechanisms have kind of run out. Okay, challenges in terms of play. Now, this is a very common stereotypical one. That person who's got toys, and rather than playing with them in the way that we would expect, does things like lining them up in a particular order. So this particular child has got a line of toy cars rather than necessarily racing them around, for example, that we might expect. Challenges in terms of playing with each other, especially if other people don't stick to the rules of the game that you're expecting, can cause problems. Sensory issues can be a challenge. Potentially that autistic learner is trying to process so many things at one time, the brain is not able to cope with that. And there are all sorts of challenges related to restrictive and repetitive behaviours as well. Now, just thinking about schools briefly, we've probably touched on all these things before, but there are all sorts of ways that the autistic individual might be impacted in school. So that challenge in terms of diagnosis, that challenge in terms of getting support. Do teachers teach them or view them in a particular way? And does the curriculum allow them an opportunity to show what they can do and engage? And perhaps the biggest problem might be that learning environment. Okay, so that child in school, for example, where as it gets closer to dinner time, smells coming from the canteen are so overwhelming that they can't engage. They're in that busy classroom where people are kind of doing group work and they can't necessarily process the noise that's going on around them. One of my friend's sons, for example, his challenge was the sensory process of the school uniform. Okay, he's 27 now, but he still can't wear trousers. He can only wear shorts because he finds the sensory information of having long trousers touching his lower legs as being overwhelming. One of the biggest problems he had was his schools wouldn't let him wear shorts. He was kind of forced to wear trousers, which meant his attendance in school was a challenge. Also put another quick video up on here if you want to follow this up, and this is a clip about Holly. Shows Holly, for example, trying to do everyday activities with peers. So in this video, she's getting on the bus to go to a party at the local skating rink with her friends, and the different challenges that she's trying to engage with on the way there, and how that impacts upon her, and how she starts to try and regulate as a result. Okay, so the bus driver's asking her questions. There's the sound of other people talking on the bus. She's walking down the road and somebody comes past her with a really noisy dog that she can hear and she can smell. She gets all confused and she walks across the road in front of somebody on a moped who starts shouting at her because he nearly knocked her over, for example. Okay, if you want to kind of follow that up after today, it's worth taking a look at some of these questions. So if you watch that video, what might Holly have been experiencing? What impact did others have on her? Very nearly getting towards the end, and I'll stop talking at you shortly. How might schools support learners who are autistic or neurodivergent? Again, we've touched upon some of these things before, but one of the key things in particular might be in terms of thinking about the environment we're asking our learners to come into, in terms of the sensory environment. Okay, how many of you went to a primary school in particular that was an old primary school? It was built perhaps before the 1930s. That was certainly my case. That school had a really nice wooden parquet floor, for example. Looked brilliant, but didn't do an awful lot in terms of deadening sounds and noise. Actually, it was really noisy when people were walking on it. Okay, so there might be challenges in terms of things like carpeted or not, number of windows or not, whether windows have blinds and do the blinds actually work or not. Do they have whiteboards and overhead projectors, and do they make a buzzing sound? Is the school too hot, too cold? But we can also think about things like the language we use in terms of the explicit environment. We can make things predictable. Now, things always change in school. There will always be a day where something you expect to happen is cancelled because of something. But can we support learners to kind of process that in advance? And we can also think about the social environment, and going back to that survey earlier on, how many of those learners did they ask wanted support to try and make friends and understand other people? And then we've just got some examples on here of more specific strategies. So if you are using autism and you are doing the assignment that links to that, maybe there is something here that could link to it. Okay, so giving children instructions which follow a particular order. We've got examples on here of things like a visual timetable or a now and next board, for example. This is what we're doing now. This is what's coming up next. So you've got that verbal and visual representation to understand and process what's coming along. So going back to the assignment, if you are going to pick this one, realistically what you're asked to look at is what is ASD? What are some of the traits and characteristics? So potentially you might be looking at the dyad of impairment, for example, and then thinking about how school and or university environment impacts upon those learners' experiences. What are the barriers they might experience in school or wider life? How might those things be overcome? Again, if anyone wants to follow up further, I've hyperlinked 3 videos on here which explore different aspects of autism. So this is a quite interesting one, for example, thinking about potential links between autism and eating disorders as a result of the sensory challenges associated with some types of food. So whether that's the texture of food or the smells of particular food, which can be really overwhelming. And then final thing I wanted to mention with you, on the additional resources page for this week, I have put some links here to 2 different things. So one of the things we've said quite a lot going through the module is maybe teachers need more training. Maybe we need to raise awareness of people more generally. There is a link here to the Autism Wales website, for example, and they do a 30-minute short e-course. Now, this is something that's free. you do have to register and sign up for it. But if it's something that you were interested in exploring a little bit further, you do get a participation certificate at the end of it, for example. And this other link that I've put up on here is a resource that they developed to support teachers, but also to support other peers in the classroom as well. And it's called the Skilty Lesson Pledge. And this is a learner called Skilty. He went to school in Llanelli, and it shows him going about his school day and also his kind of life outside school as well, and thinking about the challenges that he experiences. So really interesting one, for example, goes into the classroom, somebody sits in the seat he normally sits in, and then he has kind of a meltdown because the teacher tells him to sit somewhere else. And he can't understand, well, that's my seat. Why can't I sit there? Why have you let somebody else sit in it? I can't go and sit somewhere else because that's my seat. And there's also a nice example where him and his family are going out for the day on a Saturday. And it shows how he needs that kind of support from his parents before they go, so that he can process it and understand what's going to happen. And in the end, his parents write him a checklist. So at 8 o'clock, you're going to get up and have a shower. At 9 o'clock, you're going to have breakfast. At 10 o'clock, we're going to get in the car and we're going to drive to Auntie Susan's house. At 12 o'clock, we're going to go out for lunch. So he knows exactly concrete steps as what's going to happen during the day, so that he is aware rather than being kind of confused about what's going on. So if there is anything you want to follow up, there's a few resources there which are worth looking at. And if you're doing the assignment based on autism, then some of these are quite helpful that I've hyperlinked at the bottom of the screen as well. Okay, what is autism? What are the challenges in school? What's an autism-friendly classroom look like? Now, obviously, we didn't get to the third aspect today, so we will pick this up next week, which is social stories, which some of you might have come across or used before. So we'll have a quick look at that next week. Next week, we're also going to look at hearing impairment, visual impairment, and physical impairment. We're also going to think briefly as well about children in school who are entitled to access arrangements and reasonable adjustments. In other words, what can we do to change the environment that people do their exams in, for example? And then when we come into the final week, we're going to look at other learners who might experience challenges to inclusion, and we're going to focus on things like language, different communities, asylum seekers, refugees, children who are impacted by environmental degradation or climate change, poverty, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, for example, to try and broaden that debate out further in terms of it's not just ALN learners that have these challenges. So, very final thing, just wanted to remind you again, your mark and feedback for assignment 1 will come back at 2 o'clock next Friday. Potentially what I've mentioned at the start of the session today might be worth going back and checking things like your citations and references. Next Friday's seminars, they're going to be nothing formal. I will basically be in that room if you want to come along and bring with you what you've written at that point, or what you were thinking about the next assignment at that point, and I can help support and advise in terms of that. Other than that, next week I promise will be a bit more active and participatory rather than me talking at you. Have a lovely weekend when it comes. Thanks for coming in today, and I'll see you next week.